There are moments in history when the world holds its breath, not because of the thunder of bombs or the roar of tanks, but because of a whisper, a single word said with such power and conviction that even empires take notice. One such word came not from a battlefield but from the firm, unshakable voice of India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. And when he spoke, the halls of global power turned silent, not with fear but with the recognition of a new world awakening. In the grand theater of global diplomacy, words often act as instruments of power, tools that can either submit to pressure or stand tall in defiance. When Dr. Jaishankar uttered the phrase, "Self-respect is not negotiable," it wasn't just a diplomatic retort, it was the manifestation of centuries of struggle, survival, and sovereign awakening. That one statement, though brief, carried within it the long, unbroken breath of a civilization that had endured colonization, conflict, and condescension. It was not merely spoken in the moment, it is born of history, molded by sacrifice, and delivered with the clarity of a people who have finally found the courage to reclaim their place. What made this word so powerful was not its volume, but its truth. For decades, many in the global South, especially in post-colonial nations like India, had grown accustomed to being told what to think, how to act, and who to align with. Decisions that affected their futures were often made in distant capitals, in rooms where they had little or no voice. This imbalance was masked by phrases like international consensus or global norms. But beneath the surface was a hierarchy of power that treated self-respect as optional, a privilege that only the already powerful could afford. Jaishankar shattered that illusion with surgical precision. He made it abundantly clear that India's identity, choices, and dignity were not bargaining chips on any geopolitical table. His words were not a rejection of diplomacy, but a recalibration of it. In the past, diplomacy for weaker nations often meant smiling through humiliation, absorbing lectures without reply, and bending quietly to the weight of guidance offered by more powerful states. India had played that role once during the Cold War, during economic crises, during periods of isolation, but no more. Jaishankar's statement declared that the age of strategic silence was over. India would no longer nod politely when unfairly criticized. It would no longer accept hypocrisy wrapped in diplomacy. If a country had the right to speak boldly about its interests, so did India. If others could protect their sovereignty fiercely, so would India. And in that moment the air shifted. America and its allies realized that India was not a student in their classroom. It was a fellow architect of the global order. This proclamation of self-respect was also a message to Indians themselves. For too long, many had internalized a sense of inferiority, subtle, quiet, but ever present. They were told that their systems were inefficient, their traditions backward, their rise improbable. But when Jaishankar spoke, he ignited something deep within the national consciousness. It was a reminder that pride in one's identity is not arrogance. It is strength, that respect begins at home, in the mirror, in the belief that no nation, no matter how old or powerful, has the authority to define who you are or how you should evolve. The reverberations of that one word were not limited to America's corridors of power. It reached every newsroom, every policy think tank, every forum where India had once been seen as a junior partner. And suddenly, narratives began to shift. Analysts began to use new terms: assertive, independent, strategic, not because India had changed overnight, but because India had finally said what it had always felt, that it was no longer seeking approval. It was commanding respect. That respect was not up for negotiation, not in deals, not in debates, and certainly not in one-sided conversations. When Jaishankar said self-respect is not negotiable, he wasn't just speaking for a government. He was voicing the soul of a billion people rising from centuries of shadows into the light of their own making. The phrase multipolarity is destiny, uttered by Dr. S. Jaishankar, wasn't just a diplomatic statement, it was a profound declaration of a shifting global reality. For centuries, power has oscillated between dominant centers where empires rose and fell, and superpowers dictated the rules of the world. Whether it was the colonial might of Europe or the bipolar rigidity of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, The global order has often been centralized, unequal and exclusionary. But in those 4 words, Jaishankar announced a transformation that had already begun. An irreversible tide rising from the voices, struggles and dreams of diverse nations. He wasn't predicting the future, he was articulating a truth already in motion. And that truth was shaking the foundations of the old world. Multipolarity is more than a redistribution of power. It is the recognition that no one nation or bloc can claim moral superiority or monopolize global decision-making. It is the acceptance that prosperity, stability, and progress can no longer be dictated by a select few, but must be shared, shaped, and sustained by many. In asserting this vision, Jaishankar was not advocating chaos or disunity. On the contrary, he was championing balance, inclusion, and equity. A multipolar world does not diminish anyone, it dignifies everyone. It allows each nation to rise on its own terms, contribute through its own strengths, and engage in partnerships that are defined by mutual respect rather than coercion. This vision spoke directly to the aspirations of the Global South, nations long ignored or sidelined in the corridors of global power. It gave voice to countries whose resources were exploited, whose cultures were dismissed, and whose agency was suppressed in the name of progress defined by others. By championing multipolarity, Jaishankar was echoing their silent prayers, their hunger for equality, their rightful demand to be seen not as pawns but as players on the world stage. This wasn't just about India stepping up. It was about lifting up an entire constellation of emerging voices from Asia to Africa to Latin America. In Washington, London, and Brussels, these words rang with quiet disruption. The comfortable hierarchies that had governed international relations were being challenged, not with rage but with reason. Multipolarity, after all, is not an attack, it is a reality. The rise of China, the resilience of Russia, the resurgence of India, and the emergence of regional powers across the globe have already reshaped the geopolitical terrain. But what Jaishankar did was give that shift a name, a meaning, and a mandate. He called upon the world to acknowledge this change not with suspicion, but with responsibility. For India, the call for a multipolar world is also deeply personal. It reflects the country's own journey, complex, diverse, and rooted in the idea that unity does not require uniformity. India itself is a mosaic of languages, religions, and regions, held together not by domination but by coexistence. That internal diversity gives India a unique credibility in advocating for a global order, where many can lead and all can thrive. Jaishankar's words were a reflection of this philosophy turned outward, toward the world, offering not just critique but a constructive vision. And to the youth watching, those words offered something even more profound, a sense of place and possibility. They told a generation born into a connected, digital, and interdependent world that they would not be mere recipients of history, but its authors. That they were not destined to serve the agendas of others, but to shape the agenda for all. In Multipolarity is Destiny, Jaishankar did not just speak of a geopolitical model, he spoke of a moral compass, pointing toward fairness, dignity, and shared leadership. A world where power is not a throne but a table, and every nation has a seat. When Dr. S. Jaishankar declared, "Decolonize your mind," it wasn't merely a rhetorical flourish, or an abstract intellectual concept. It was a thunderclap cutting through decades of subtle dominance, a powerful call to arms that reverberated far beyond political circles. This was a challenge aimed not only at the West, but at the very soul of post-colonial nations, who for generations had inherited systems, ideologies, and narratives shaped by those who once ruled them. It was a demand to shed inherited inferiority, to break free from the shackles that linger invisibly in thoughts, beliefs, and worldviews. In that one line, he exposed the invisible chains still worn by many around the world, and he called on all of us to cast them off with dignity and resolve. Colonialism was never just about land or resources. It was a conquest of the mind. It replaced pride with shame, history with distortion, and confidence with dependence. Even after political independence was won, mental colonization continued. Nations that had once stood as cradles of civilization began to question their worth. They adopted foreign standards of success, embraced imported models of governance, and often looked outward for validation. Even the languages they spoke in elite circles, the textbooks they studied, and the suits they wore were subtle affirmations of a legacy not yet abandoned. Jaishankar's call pierced through this fog of quiet compliance. He dared nations to not just reclaim their borders, but to reclaim their self-image. When he spoke of decolonizing the mind, he was reminding the world that there is wisdom in indigenous systems, strength in native languages, and value in civilizational experiences that predate Western dominance by millennia. He was not rejecting modernity. He was demanding a more inclusive version of it, one that does not erase culture in the name of progress. His message was one of mental liberation, of looking inward for inspiration rather than upward for permission. For too long, the West has held the pen that writes the story of the world. Jaishankar handed it back to those whose stories were never told truthfully. In educational institutions across former colonies, students still learn about the world from Eurocentric lenses. They are taught that civilization began in Greece, democracy was invented in Europe, and leadership looks like men in powdered wigs. But what about the libraries of Nalanda, the urban planning of Mohenjo-daro, the legal principles of the Mauryas, or the maritime strength of the Cholas? These histories were either erased or romanticized as relics, never respected as living contributions to humanity. When Jaishankar spoke, he didn't just speak to politicians, he spoke to every student, every teacher, every thinker who had ever felt that their own heritage was somehow second best. He called them to remember, to reclaim, and to rise. To America and the West, this was an uncomfortable truth. For decades they had viewed themselves as the torchbearers of progress, the arbiters of democracy, the teachers of the developing world. But Jaishankar's statement revealed that the age of tutelage was over. It was time for dialogue, not diktats. Time for mutual respect, not moral superiority. And more importantly, it was time for those who had been shaped by colonization to stop mimicking their former masters and start defining their own future. This idea of mental decolonization is not just philosophical, it has practical consequences. It affects how policies are made, how media narratives are framed, how cultures are preserved, and how innovation is pursued. It shifts power from imitation to authenticity. When a country believes in its own value, it no longer waits for a seat at the table, it builds its own. And when people see their identity as a strength, not a burden, they rise with unshakable confidence. This was the true power behind Jaishankar's words, a revolution not of weapons but of thought, where the battlefield is the mind and the victory is freedom. When Dr. S. Jaishankar asserted strategic autonomy is our right, he didn't just make a policy statement, he redefined India's role in a world shaped by shifting alliances, conflicting interests, and power politics. It was a bold affirmation of sovereignty in an age when global pressure often comes dressed as partnership, and cooperation can sometimes mean compliance. These words, quietly powerful, cut through decades of diplomatic conditioning, where countries were expected to pick sides, follow directives, and compromise their interests to fit into pre-existing global camps. Jaishankar's declaration was a mirror held up to the world, especially the West, making it clear that India would no longer be a passive participant in international affairs, but an independent force guided by its own compass. Strategic autonomy, as he presented it, is not about isolation, it's about discernment. It means that India will choose its allies and decisions based on national interest, not on pressure or precedent. It is the right to say yes when it benefits the nation, to say no when it doesn't, and to walk its own path, even when it runs against the tide. This approach is rooted in history. India has always valued non-alignment, not as a sign of indecisiveness, but as a proud assertion of neutrality and independence. In the Cold War era, when the world was rigidly divided between two superpowers, India stood its ground, forming a third path that valued peace, dialogue, and domestic priority. Today, in a multipolar world, that same principle is being reimagined, not as reluctance to engage but as confidence to choose wisely. When the Ukraine conflict erupted, much of the Western world demanded that India fall in line with their stance. They expected unequivocal condemnation, severance of ties, and alignment with NATO narratives. But India held firm, not because it supported war, but because it understood nuance, because strategic autonomy allowed it to weigh its options, not just in moral terms but in terms of economic stability, energy security, and long-term regional interests. And when questioned, Jaishankar responded with clarity, not apology. He reminded the world that nations like India do not need to justify acting in their own interests, they only need the courage to stand by those decisions. This commitment to autonomy goes far beyond foreign policy. It influences trade, technology, defense, and development. In a world where supply chains are vulnerable, currencies are politicized, and sanctions are used as tools of power, a country that cannot act independently becomes a pawn. Jaishankar's vision resists that fate. He sees India as a nation capable of building its own capacities, forming diverse partnerships, and resisting dependency. Whether it's developing indigenous vaccine technology during the pandemic, pushing for defense self-reliance, or engaging with both the US and Russia without contradiction, India is asserting that autonomy is not just a privilege of the powerful, it is the right of every sovereign nation. To the world's younger democracies and emerging economies, this message is deeply empowering. It challenges the assumption that only the West has the wisdom to lead or the strength to choose. It opens the door for new alliances based on equality, not hierarchy. And to the people of India, it is a reminder that their nation has matured, not just economically or militarily, but diplomatically. That it has learned from the past, adapted to the present, and is ready for the future. When Jaishankar says strategic autonomy is our right, he is not seeking permission, he is asserting presence. A presence that no longer bends under pressure, that no longer waits to be heard, but that speaks firmly, clearly, and with purpose. It is the voice of a nation that has discovered its strength, and now refuses to let it be dictated by anyone else. When Dr. S. Jaishankar said, "We are not the problem, we are the solution," he wasn't defending India from criticism, he was reframing the entire global conversation. With those words, he shifted the lens through which developing nations are often viewed by powerful countries and global institutions. For too long, countries like India have been portrayed as laggards, obstacles or burdens, when it comes to international issues such as climate change, economic growth, or global health. But in that one bold sentence, Jaishankar held up a mirror to the world and said, "Look again. You are looking at the problem solvers, not the problem." This wasn't just clever rhetoric, it was a powerful affirmation of India's contributions to the world, especially in times of crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, while many wealthier nations hoarded vaccines and medical supplies, India led with humanity, exporting millions of vaccine doses to over 100 countries, often at its own cost. When climate change became the focus of global dialogue, India didn't plead for sympathy, it presented tangible solutions, including massive investments in renewable energy, electric mobility, and sustainable urban development. Despite being far behind the developed nations in terms of historical emissions, India committed to bold targets like net zero by 2070, not because it was forced to, but because it understood its responsibility. Jaishankar's words echoed the quiet resilience of a nation that has consistently chosen contribution over complaint. The global narrative has often been designed by powers that see themselves as saviors, and others as those to be saved. But this statement flipped that paradigm. He reminded the world that India is not a dependent waiting for aid, not a rebel disrupting order, but a partner building solutions from digital infrastructure to disaster response. Whether it's the digital public infrastructure DPI model powering financial inclusion, or the space missions that inspire innovation across the global south, India has become a source of ideas that are scalable, affordable, and sustainable. The deeper meaning of this statement also lies in its challenge to global hypocrisy. Developed nations often prescribe policies to others without cleaning up their own records, whether it's on emissions, debt sustainability, or human rights. Jaishankar made it clear that double standards will no longer be tolerated. India will not be talked down to, it will be engaged with, respected, and listened to. His words declared that nations with lived experience of poverty, colonization, and rapid development have insights that the world desperately needs. Solutions cannot come only from the boardrooms of the West. They must also come from the grassroots realities of the East and the South. To developing nations, these words were a rallying cry. They offered a new script, one that didn't ask for pity, but demanded parity. One that said you don't have to wait to be acknowledged. You can lead right now from where you are with what you have. It was a call to own one's narrative, to walk with pride, and to turn every label into a ladder. We are not the problem, we are the solution. Was not just about India, it was about every country that has ever been underestimated, every people who have ever been overlooked. For young Indians and global citizens alike, this message holds the power to change mindsets. It tells students, entrepreneurs, engineers, diplomats, and artists that they are not working from behind. They are leading from the front. It invites them to see their work as vital to the progress of humanity, not just to their local economy. It turns duty into pride and contribution into identity. In those few words, Jaishankar carved out a new space for emerging powers to stand, not in the shadow of legacy powers but in the bright light of their own making.